I don't know if any of you have ever encountered situations or conversations where it goes something like, I'm not going to take your money out of principle, or I'm not going to do such and such because it's a matter of principle that I don't or I do such a thing, right? And so the word principle for me, what is the meaning of that word? The definition of a principle is a fundamental truth or proposition. In other words, it's a conviction that one holds so strongly that one maybe sometimes is even willing to die for it, right? And so the big question is, does Unitarian Universalism have any such strong belief or conviction that we're willing to put our bodies and our lives on the line for? Now, some may argue that in order to be a UU, you don't have to believe anything. Now, I think that's a bunch of you know what, right? That from its inception, Unitarians and Universalists have always had a set of principles. This congregation, for example, is a Universalist congregation, and in 1803, there's a document called the Winchester Profession. It's a very short document. It only had 3 articles in it. And if I read it to you today, most of us, myself included, would not subscribe to these principles because they're mostly theological around the nature of God and Jesus and the Bible and all that stuff that is no longer relevant today. But at that time, it was quite revolutionary for a denomination to come out and say that we believe in a God of love who will not condemn anyone to hell for all of eternity. So that's what the Universalists preach at the time. And again, this was the 19th century, right? And no one was preaching this gospel before. Everyone was talking about hellfire and damnation and all these ways to guilt people into believing certain things about the faith. And so, while that may have been revolutionary for its time, I hope we've certainly evolved ever since. So by the time of consolidation back in 1961 between the Unitarians and the Universalists, we don't call it a merger, by the way, because that implies some kind of corporate hostile takeover, right, of one denomination over the other. So we called it a friendly consolidation between 2 similarly minded denominations. And when they got together, they came up with 6 principles. Now, don't ask me to tell you or recite to you what those principles are, because, I have enough things on my head to remember at this point. I haven't quite memorized those 6 principles because, again, they're kind of outdated at this point. In fact, in 1985, during the General Assembly, there was an intentional effort to revise those 6 principles, which meant that they got rid of, for example, sexist language. Because the original 1961 6 principles had a lot of references to men and mankind in there. So they got rid of that. And thanks to the neo-pagans, we added a 7th principle, which is the respect for the interdependent web of life which we are a part of. So our 7th principle, which is very well beloved and which many of you will find on my signature, right, on my email signature, actually didn't come until 1985. And so the 6 principles were also reconfigured to put at the very top EWOD, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, which is the principle that most UUs recognize these days. When we go out and we tell people who we are, we usually say, we're the folks who believe that each person has inherent worth and dignity. And the second principle talks about justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And the third principle talks about acceptance of one another and an encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. The fourth principle talks about a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And the fifth principle talks about the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process, both in our congregations and in society at large. The sixth principle talks about a world community where peace, justice, and liberty reigns for all. And I already talked to you about the seventh principle. And yet, as we began to live into these principles, especially the Black, Indigenous, people of color communities started wondering if there was even a place for them explicitly mentioned within the seven principles. So back in 2013, someone came up with language around what would it mean for us to make a strong commitment towards a greater sense of wholeness by building beloved community and working very intentionally to dismantle all systems of racism and other forms of oppression. So there was this conversation that then took place because it takes a whole ratification process to adopt another principle. And this congregation is no exception to that. So there was discussion 2 years ago about whether or not to adopt the eighth principle. And while that was happening, back in 2017, at a General Assembly, the co-moderators of our faith got together and said, you know what? It is time to revise Article 2 altogether. And again, Article 2 is the section in the UUA's bylaws that talks about what our principles and sources are. And it begins with the line of, we members of the Unitarian Universalist Association covenant to affirm and promote X, Y, and Z. So again, there's this word covenant of what do we agree upon within our congregations to affirm and promote. Now, in 2017, there was this big question of what is at the heart of Unitarian Universalism today. Now, let me make a note about why we try to do this at least every 15 years. Because as I pointed out before, language changes, right, and evolves over time. The use of the word sick, for example, used to have a negative connotation. Like, oh my gosh, someone is sick. Do we need to go visit them in the hospital, or do they need to see a doctor? But as we know with millennials and even Gen Zers, sick actually means something good. Like when something, awesome happens, you say, oh, that's sick, man, right? You've heard of that, right? Especially those of you who have kids. So language changes and evolves over time, and more importantly, we are part of a living tradition that changes over time. As we grow and as we learn and as we hear from others about what makes them tick and what theological perspective they're coming from and what gives them meaning in life, all of that evolves and changes over time. In fact, one of our theologians, James Luther Adams, says that revelation is not sealed. I love the way that's framed, that we are an ever-evolving faith. So the question that was put forward back in 2017 when a study commission was put together is, what is at the heart of our faith? I love that question. And a corollary question to that is, what makes your heart sing? Which then got us to a place of maybe it's not a bunch of words and sentences, as much as we love our words and sentences, but it's about our core values. When we distill it to the very essence of what drives us to do this work, what are our core values as Unitarian Universalists? And so it probably comes as no surprise that this process involved a bunch of videos and feedback forms and surveys and Zoom sessions. And by the way, 11,000 people filled out that survey, right, of answering that question. And when they collated all of it together, by May of 2023, they had come up with a basic structure of what our core values are, and it fleshes them out further into what does each of these core values mean. And by the time General Assembly rolled around in 2023 of last year, there were 13 amendments to what they came up with before. So those 13 amendments were discussed. In other words, there's a process to this whole thing, because again, we love our processes. Because unlike more hierarchical institutions, we don't just follow a decree or a papal bull or some kind of order from on high, right? That this is very much a grassroots, bottom-up kind of a process that we put in place. And the result is, I'm going to have Melanie projected on the screen, is what we call our values flower. I love it because, you know, a couple of weeks ago during Earth Day, I talked about flowers being my favorite part of nature, right? So all these petals is what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to save the pistil, the center part, for next week and the following week. But needless to say, what would it mean for us to have values that are not so much heady, but again, heartfelt values, and ones that challenge us to really go deep into what the religious educators came up with an acronym for this. JET-PIG is all you have to remember. And if you can't remember that, just think about, you know, aspirations are kind of like when pigs fly, right? So when a pig gets on a jet, this is you know, kind of a way to memorize these values. So J stands for justice, E stands for equity, T stands for transformation, P stands for pluralism, I stands for interdependence, and G stands for generosity. Isn't that easier to remember than going around all the petals and trying to remember all of that? And what I love about it is that it actually incorporates all of the previous principles and sources that we draw from, right? That we haven't lost interdependence, that's still there. We haven't lost equity, that's still there. And of course, we also value inherent worth and dignity, which is why we're working for justice and equity in all our relationships. And a perfect example of, well, before I go there, I also like the fact that unlike the way we listed our 7 principles before, or 8 principles, it was more like a laundry list. This, for me, recognizes the intersectionality more and the ways that all of the ways that the jet pigs intersects with one another to finally put love at the center of it all. So let me give an example of our values at work. Back in September 11th of 2001, a few of you were actually members of this congregation around that time, you may recall that there were a few congregants who actually stationed themselves outside the doors of this congregation and handed out bottled waters to all the passersby. Some were shell-shocked, some were grieving the loss of their loved ones, some were glued to the news, finding out what's going on. And it was a great way for Fourth Universalists to bear witness to the suffering and the pain around the events of 9/11. And it's our way of making sure that we approach this from a justice-based perspective, and that we took a look at the equity lens to this, of what led those people on that plane to fly into the Twin Towers? What led to this global situation where 5,000 lives, over 5,000 lives, were lost during that brief period in time? So justice, equity, and there was certainly an effort towards transformation and a way to look at this not from an us versus them perspective, especially the rising Islamophobia and anti-Arab sentiment that was beginning to brew in our country. So how could we approach this from the sense of pluralism and realize that we are interdependent on one another, and what hurts one hurts us all. And finally, just by having bottled water out there, giving it to people for free is an act of radical generosity. And this afternoon, as we're gonna go through our budget, we realize that the budget is a moral document. How we spend our money is how we put our values and how we put our faith into action, amen? So, JetPig, it's not just a bunch of words. It's actually how we bear witness out in a hurting world as Unitarian Universalists. So, I'm gonna leave you with a cliffhanger because you'll notice I haven't talked about love yet. And so next week, I'm gonna make my Broadway debut for Les Miserables. I'm gonna be playing the role of Javert, so y'all better come back for that. And so we're gonna be talking about what does love actually mean? So for the next 2 weeks, we're gonna continue this series. But for now, I invite you to just sit with our 7 core values and begin to think about, do these make your heart sing? Because we're gonna be voting on this in June, right? And if so, how can we live it out in our world so that we continue to embody our dynamic faith?
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Getting the Message. My name's Kerwin Seeger. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the new acting religious education assistant here at Fourth U.
Congratulations. It's your first Getting the Message, isn't it?
Yes, I'm so excited to be here. And I'm with Reverend Jonipher. How are you today?
I promise to go easy on you. Excuse me. I'm doing well. Thanks for asking.
Fantastic. So today's sermon is about a lot of the changes in Unitarian Universalists mindset and just like the different principles that the UUA has going on. So can you talk a little bit about what might have inspired both the change at the UUA largely, but also this sermon specifically?
Sure. We are about a month and a half away from General Assembly, which is our annual gathering of Unitarian Universalists from all over the country, sometimes all over the world, actually. And we are revisiting our principles and our sources, and now we're calling them our values.
Okay.
And this happens it's supposed to happen anyway, every 15 years, believe it or not, because as I mentioned in the sermon, sometimes these things get stale, sometimes our language changes and evolves. And so we want to make sure that we keep up to speed on it, so to speak, and that we still remain relevant. And so that's why we're revisiting or taking a look at what the proposed values are. And this is going to be the second year, actually, that we're passing it at General Assembly. Last year, we had 13 whopping amendments, right? Lucky 13. And so we are taking those amendments into consideration and, not necessarily wordsmithing it, but making sure that it includes the suggestions that were brought forward from last General Assembly. And so people are going to be voting on it in about a month and a half from now.
Fantastic. So as someone that comes from a more top-down theological mindset, I grew up Catholic, I am very still unfamiliar with a lot of the inner workings of the UUA. So it's really cool to see that all parishioners, regardless of level of experience or status, quote unquote, in the church, have a say in that. Can you maybe talk me through the process as to what the UUA went through to kind of hear different voices in establishing?
Sure. So unlike the Catholic Church that has papal bulls, which sometimes could be just that, but no comment, we have a more bottom-up, grassroots level kind of organizing. So even the words for the eighth principle, for example, they came from one person's head in terms of what words we want to use to try to describe how to dismantle racism and other forms of oppression and build beloved community. But then that was championed by another person, Paula Cole Jones, who was, kind of part of this part of the country, actually, and who then worked for the UUA. And but before she even worked for the UUA, she already started educating congregations about the importance of the eighth principle. But each congregation needs to adopt it. And we have about 1,000 congregations, because part of what we're talking about here is Article 2 of our bylaws, right? And in order to amend that, it's kind of like ratifying the any amendment for the Constitution, for example. We need each individual state to approve it. So just yesterday, I watched the musical Suffs, and they were talking about how Tennessee was actually that mark where it could go either way, and it literally depended on one state senator's vote, right? And so we too, as Unitarian Universalists, value the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process. And so we want to make sure that each congregation, before they even ratify it, has an opportunity to discuss it amongst themselves to make sure that people buy into it. So it takes a lot longer. And yet, unlike the Quakers, though, we don't operate out of consensus. So we don't need every single person to buy in, but rather we do go with the majority. But I'm hoping that there's enough of a synergy and critical mass within each congregation in order for something like this to pass and to be voted on at General Assembly, again, which is the national body that has delegates from all over the country, and including ministers voting on key issues that affect our lives. Because, at the end of the day, the Article 2 talks about the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations covenant affirm and promote to covenant to X, Y, and Z. And that's where the now 8 principles, hopefully, and the 6 sources, and now the 7 values, I should say, comes into play. It's sometimes a messy process rather than just the Pope or even the bishops telling people what to do, right? But for me, it's one that gives ownership back to the people, which is all, not just us ministers who are, have the fancy schmancy titles.
Yes. All right. Amazing. It sounds like it's a very thorough and engaging process, but like you said, it's a bit messy. One of the things I've heard both from you and other members of the congregation recently is a lot of talk about grounding in love.
Yes.
And can you talk maybe a little bit about how this process was grounded in love, but also how we should approach grounding ourselves in love as we kind of go into what could be a time of change in the UUA?
That is a very good question, and I invite you to come back 2 weeks from now, because next week we'll be doing a musical all about love, right? So super excited about my Broadway debut. And the following week is when we'll unpack that and talk more about what it means to put love at the center, which, again, a little bit of a sneak preview here for you all, is part of the core of universalism, because this congregation specifically was founded as a Universalist congregation with the idea that God is love. And if you have a loving God, that God can't send anyone to hell for all of eternity, right? And so from that root is where we get our grounding of universal love, basically. The same as universal suffrage or universal health care. Universal everything needs to be grounded from an ethic of love.
Amazing, amazing. Well, I can think of no better way to end than on a cliffhanger. So tune in 2 weeks for more about grounding and love. But thank you so much for being here with me.
Thank you, Erwin, for your amazing first getting the message.
Appreciate it.
I really appreciate your questions. And we'll be back next week.
Yes, we'll see you next week.